Hello and welcome to Successfully Establish a Stormwater Utility webinar. Glad you've all joined us today. We're going to start with a poll. Where is your community in adopting a stormwater utility? Please go ahead and select one of the answers here, and we will collect those responses as I give you a little introduction about today's webinar. We're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have the same very informative conversation that we've been having in this series with Luke asking questions of Dory and Shannon, who will introduce all of them in just a moment. But we've pre-recorded the conversation so that the speakers can be on to answer any questions you have during the recording. We think that it's probably a little bit uncomfortable to ask a question to people who are in the middle of a conversation. So we thought we'd try this. It might make it a lot easier for all of you to engage live with our speakers if you know that the presentation is pre-recorded. So we'll go ahead and have them answer questions digitally as the recording is happening. And then at the end, we'll also have some live open audio Q&A time as well. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone, and hopefully you all can enjoy the presentation in that format. To ask a question, if you are on a laptop, you'll go down to the bottom left and you'll see a little Q&A widget. The opening screen showed you that, and you can see what it looks like down there. You could open the Q&A widget down there and ask the question. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the screen and it'll bring up the little widgets at the bottom and you can press the Q&A right there. So let's see how we did on our poll, and then we'll start the recording. 50% currently developing our stormwater management. That's definitely the winner. And then the other 25% already has a stormwater utility in place, and 25, I don't know. We are not surprised that 25% said, I don't know. That's actually a pretty common state for people to be in around this massive topic of stormwater management and stormwater utility. So hopefully we will help you discover a lot of those answers during today's conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. Please do ask any questions that come up to you during the conversation. I'll also push a couple questions out through the Q&A widget as it goes along to help encourage folks to bring the conversation to life for them. Thank you and enjoy the discussion. Good morning and welcome to Successfully Establish a Stormwater Utility webinar. I'm glad you've all joined us for this discussion. Let's jump right in. Luke, Strategic Solutions Consultant here at Brightly, will be our moderator today. Luke comes from a background in energy automation and HVAC controls and has been with Brightly software for about 10 years. After receiving his FMP in 2017, Luke is focused on both sides of asset management world, day-to-day operations. Good morning and welcome to Successfully Establish a Stormwater Utility webinar. I'm glad you've all joined us for this discussion. Let's jump right in. Luke, Strategic Solutions Consultant here at Brightly, will be our moderator today. Luke comes from a background in energy automation and HVAC controls and has been with Brightly software for about 10 years. After receiving his FMP in 2017, Luke is focused on both sides of asset management world, day-to-day operations and long-term strategic capital planning. Luke spends his work days at his home office juggling his 4-year-old son, Everett, new baby Elizabeth, and his attorney wife, Alex. Luke's current role as strategic consultant allows him to consult with civic leaders, helping to establish clear and justified capital plans. Welcome, Luke. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tracy. Welcome, everybody. Excited to be here today. We've got a great set of content to cover. Stormwater utility. I know for all the people I talk to, stormwater tends to be one of those things that is always second or third on the list until it goes really bad, and then it becomes number one very quickly. So hopefully today can be a good conversation to kind of mitigate some of that. So I've got two experts here with me from WithersRavenel, Dory Sabad, the director of the Stormwater practice group there, and Shannon Moore, director of the Financial Services group at Withers. So we're really going to dive in and kind of explore what does it take to set up a stormwater utility, what's that best approach. So Dory here, our stormwater leader with WithersRavenel, seasoned engineer and project manager with over 20 years experience working in municipal water, transportation, and private sectors. A lot of technical expertise coming from Dory, hydraulic modeling, natural systems protection, restoration, watershed management, infrastructure design, dam engineering. We can keep going here. But the background's very extensive with the project development, the planning, the scoping, the budgeting, QA, QC of those projects, making sure we're capturing the right data, and then the construction service. So big focus with client staff management, stormwater professionals for private customers as well as municipal customers there at Withers. He's also a certified GIS pro and erosion and sediment designer. So Dory, thank you very much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you.
And Shannon here, the other half of our dream team, over 20 years experience as well in the financial side, working both private and public. Recently, she was the finance director for City of Salisbury here in North Carolina, overseeing city finances, debt management, the city accounting, purchasing, budgeting. I think a lot of us know what finance does, but the list keeps going on as well. But a lot of big responsibility in the service department around establishing that utility rate model, enhancement to the capital program. During her time there at the City of Salisbury, Shannon was a part of the team that implemented their utility startup. So went from stormwater being kind of just another expense to actually having a utility fund for it. So including different studies to update those expenses and those costs. So it'll be good to get the insight from Shannon as well. So we're pleased to have you both here. And if you guys are good, we can start with the first question.
Great.
Fantastic. Welcome. So I want to start with kind of a higher level one. Personally, I have a house down in Fuquay, Verena, that is on the edge of a floodplain. It's not technically in a floodplain, but I was doing research on it. According to FEMA, flooding is the most common and one of the most expensive natural disasters in the U.S. So obviously, stormwater is extremely important. Can you talk a little bit about why establishing a utility for stormwater is kind of one of those most important first steps?
Yeah, perfect. I can start really with the high-level overview and to piggyback on what Luke you just mentioned initially. I mean, stormwater used to be like third, maybe fourth on this on the list of priorities, and we have come a long way since we used to say stormwater, just water flows downhill. Like we really need to manage stormwater effectively and efficiently. And we have concerns, both flooding that you mentioned, as well as the water qualities and the regulatory environment. So really it has become a more predominant issue that needs to be addressed by municipalities. And a good way to look at it is first inventory and assess what you have, like the assessment of the system that you have as a municipality, how you can manage it, and then start to do your planning, master planning, to identify some hotspots, some deficiencies, and how to fix them. And from there, you can go to your engineering, construction, and maintenance. And that cycle, it's just a circle that keeps going further. And on top of that, you will have to meet some regulatory requirement. Like if you are an MS4 municipality, you need to manage your stormwater and report on how you are managing it accordingly. So that's a big high-level overview, and we can dig more into the detail later. The last item on top of this is like really it's easy to list all what's needed, but every single item of those will require funding, and with this, Shannon can also provide some input on the funding.
Yeah, so in addition to the technical aspects that Dory talked about, there's a finance mechanism that has to be utilized to pay for stormwater services. Those can be funded through the general fund, or those can be funded through what we call an enterprise fund, which is essentially a separate set of books to manage the stormwater revenue and the stormwater expenses. And so with that, you set up user fees, just like a water and sewer utility, where users pay into the fund to create a funding mechanism to pay for some of the capital needs. In addition to user funds, you also have opportunities with some state and federal grant funding programs that will pay for sometimes planning grants to do some of that master planning and engineering assessment that Dory spoke about. And then also you have construction grants that help you pay for capital improvements. And of course, right now with a lot of flooding across the U.S., there's opportunities where there's resiliency improvements through your stormwater control and stormwater management services that you can often find federal and state grants to pay for some of those large capital costs. So definitely have to have a funding mechanism to pay for all of the technical aspects that Dory's team put together.
So Shannon, I got a question on that. So a little bit off script, but if somebody's going after starting that stormwater utility and they want to, obviously everybody wants free money. So going after that state and that federal, the EPA grants, all that good information, do those types of processes, those types of grants and federal state funding, do those typically come before somebody has established a utility, or is that something we establish a utility, then we kind of go after that bucket of money, or is it kind of just depending on the municipality?
So it depends on the funding source, typically. Sometimes there are planning grants where communities want to explore the option of starting a stormwater fund and they don't really have anything yet. And so it helps them with the startup. And then there are some planning grants that if they're running their program through, say, the general fund, and they want to do some additional analysis to actually start a stormwater utility fund, a separate entity apart from the general fund, there's sometimes some costs that will go into some of that planning. So it really varies by the funding round and by the funding source.
Are these typically one bucket of money that does 4 different things, or these 4 different kind of grant opportunities depending on where you are in your process?
Yeah, so it depends on the need of the client and kind of where they are currently in their journey. Oftentimes the planning grant is kind of the start of the process. And then later, once you've established from Dory's side of the house, on the engineering side, your master planning and some major capital, you can start going after some of those larger construction grants.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, sorry about the side note. I was curious about that. So I want to dig a little bit to what Dory said a second ago about that. You know, you mentioned kind of a process there with gathering the data, the assessing, the planning, the engineering, the construction, the maintenance. So I've heard a lot, you know, comes to capital improvement plans, CIPs, but then we also have master plans. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how those compare and contrast in terms of decision making, you know, creating different rules and ordinances and basing budgets on those different types of documents. Any insight in there, Dory?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question, actually, because it's always leads to confusion. A lot of municipalities, sometimes we see it, it's like we're trying to develop a capital improvement plan or just list the items that are needed, but it's always a reactive decision rather than a proactive. And that's where the master planning comes to play. So you will have to plan ahead and let your master planning guide your capital improvement and guide your decision making, as well as doing the assessment. So we look at it in 2 types. So you can do your inventory to know what you have first, do your assessment of the system. What's the age? What's the criticality? What is the consequence of failure? Criticality, and to evaluate all those. And this will guide you in knowing, to be able to look ahead and see what is coming in terms of maintenance and replacement needs. And then with doing the master planning also, you will study your area, identify deficiencies where you are lacking the correct infrastructure. And then you start to evaluate some alternatives. And then you prioritize everything based on the impact, environmental impact, social impacts, and the technical return on that investment. You're improving your level of service that you are providing to specific communities. And that will allow you to prioritize your projects, where you want to go from them. And really, it will help you to maybe identify source of funding. You asked about the funding for it, because for each type of project, and that's what Shannon was talking about, like different types of projects and grants that are available, you will have different venues. There are grants available to even help with the master planning and go forward. Some of the grants that we have seen recently will give additional credit if you evaluate the possibility of establishing a stormwater utility. And that will be just extra points on how your project will score, because typically every grant almost is on a competitive basis, and you need to select projects that will rank accordingly. So that's where having that master planning will allow you to develop a CIP that is based on a good study and evaluation, rather than a problem that happened and we're trying to take care of it, and we're going to put a patch in here until we are going to find some way to take care of it more in details. And one thing in here, while talking about the funding sources and the guiding it to the CIP, even at that level of the project, it's good to start to engage with the elected officials on the stormwater utility and what are the benefits of having a stormwater utility actually for the community to be able to support that system, that stormwater system. Once you present the needs to the elected officials, they can take it and make decisions and inform their citizens that this is what we need. That's why we're doing it. It is not just an additional tax in here. It's more like a utility, similar to how you get your water at home, and it is run as a utility. I need to think of it the same way. And having that engagement early in the process will garner public support and elected officers support much better.
Interesting. And this might be kind of a loaded question, because I think I know the answer, but I'm trying to fully kind of grasp it. You mentioned level of service a few times. You mentioned funding, and we've mentioned gathering data. So kind of putting those together, if I'm at square one, maybe I haven't done an inventory today. So my first step really is to go out and just figure out, what do I own? Where is it all located? I would think that kind of the core information we would want to know is, where is that item located? What is the capacity of that item? How much stormwater can it handle? Maybe when was it installed? Material things like that. Is there a standard kind of approach when you're capturing that very first step of assessing data of what type of information we could be capturing? And I'm going to give you a follow-up question about level of service. So. And that one for you, please.
Yeah, I can start with that one. This way we don't, because it's a good question. And there is, we have a good operating procedure. We established a procedure of how to go about with that one. So that basic data collection, we will start with trying to gather what is available, because there's always some sources that are available, and we want it to be the most cost-efficient way of doing a data collection. To start from scratch is not good, but having a good solid data from the beginning will make the process much better. So really that's the building block for any assessment. And we have developed a database design and everything that will allow us from the start of the project know what we need to collect, because we need to know the end goal. We always want to look at the end goal before you start the collection so that you don't miss anything and have to redo some of that work. So we have developed a standard database where we can enter the information that is needed in terms of doing the hydraulic modeling, the hydrologic modeling, and all that information to assess the capacity of the system. But also it has the flexibility, because there are specific needs within each community that will allow you to add items to it. For example, some communities might be doing certain level of easement acquisitions or maintenance of private systems that they need to capture that difference between who owns what, or if they have some agreement with other municipalities of who is doing what, and we can tailor that database for it. So really the initial step is that data collection, knowing where things are geographically, knowing how they work hydraulically, and then from there we take it to assessing the capacity, identifying which ones don't meet the capacity and how to fix them. And also while doing the mapping, we do an assessment of the condition of the system. So when we are there, we could do an initial visual inspection of the system, identify how they are, and if any maintenance only is needed, we'll identify it, or if any items are in a critical condition that they might fail recently soon, then we'll adjust that. And we could take it further. Some items, we identify them that you need further investigation in the field, and that's where we could do some CCTV. So we run cameras inside the pipes to identify some of the conditions in there. And without making it too big, usually breaking it in chunks is really good. So it could start, even the assessment could start by high priority areas. That's where we need to do the inventory, the assessment, and then you can build on it. It can stay a dynamic database that you keep growing it and expanding it as needed.
Interesting. And brought up a second question, it's kind of off the cuff, but do people have to assess every linear foot of every stormwater pipe and every culvert, or are there strategies to kind of say, hey, you know, we've got this section of town that was all built in 1990, and we're going to assess 25% of the stormwater structures and apply logic? Is there anything like that from the stormwater standpoint?
Yeah, early on, we'll start the initial assessment. We can do like a desktop assessment based on condition of the overall area. Like we look at the overall area. You mentioned when it was built. That's a critical item. We have the material of the pipe that was installed. We know what installation techniques was used, and we can start to see some. If we know of failures that are happening, then it will bump it to a higher priority. This way, they don't have to assess each and every pipe from the get-go. But you want to keep a record of what has been assessed, what has not, and then once you have established funds maybe for it, you can say, I'm going to inspect 20% of my system every year. So, because this, we mentioned at the beginning, it's a circle. So once you are done, you get to start again because you have to keep inspecting them and going through that and putting that vision that, okay, we're going to be inspecting these 20%, next year these 20%. And once you are on a rotating basis, you don't have that as many surprises. Mm-hmm. Well, there's always some of them that will come up, but you can minimize them.
That's right. A great quote I heard one time. Somebody said, you never get hit by the bus that you see coming. Right? He said that it's never the project on the list that you have that fails that causes the catastrophic event. It's always the project that's not on that list. And everybody's like, wait a minute, we didn't know that was going to happen. And that's the bus that always ends up hitting you. And the final piece on this story, just we mentioned level of service, and I love the idea of level of service because, you know, especially in the municipal world, level of service, you know, how good does it need to be? And everybody wants everything to be perfect, but nobody wants to fund things at that level of perfect. So can you talk to me about what some of the ranges and some of the ideas behind level of service specifically with stormwater?
Yeah, perfect. That's a perfect question, actually, and a lot of municipalities are tackling this really head on because the level of service in stormwater, when we talk about it, is what kind of storm event do you want to accommodate? Because we're not going to be able to put just pipes that will accommodate every major storm event that occurs. And then you will identify the risks associated with it, and it could be based on the locations. So major evacuation routes or major streets will have a higher level of service than other minor streets. If you have a dead end or a street that is reaching a critical facility, you will increase that level of service. And this level of service is defined by that storm event. We talk about the 1-year storm event or 10-year storm event or 25, and really it's the probability of having a storm during any year. And it is the most common items for smaller streets are the 10-year event and 25-year design event. These are the very common items in North Carolina, although some municipalities don't have it. These are items that go in the ordinance typically or in your design criteria and manual where you implement the requirement of level of service. When the area is being developed, that is the storm design that you will go for it. And then you have another level of service that relates to water quality, and that's a state requirement for specific basins. Depending on which basin you are in, you need to treat the water to a certain quality. And on top of that, the local municipality has the option to go above and beyond what the state requires, and that can be factored in. Typically, those water quality level of service are managed by doing stormwater control measures, so putting a pond or some other treatment device before you release all the runoff from stormwater into open water bodies. But in terms of flooding, those are really design storm events. So major highways might have the 50 or even the 100-year event where we want to see it. And unfortunately, in recent years, we've been seeing an increase in the number of events. So we talked about probability, that the 100-year event is an event that has a 1% chance of occurring in a year, but we're seeing several of them in any year, any given year, and in consecutive years these days. So that's something that we need to look for. In some of the coastal communities, we're starting to analyze, to see events and evaluate them for sunny day flooding, we're calling them, because it's not raining, but because of the tides and what you get from the ocean, you're starting to see the water back up into the storm system, and streets are starting to flood just based on that event. So we will also account for those factors when we are working in coastal areas. We have plenty of them where we'll account for variation in the sea level and the tide that we're seeing.
Interesting. Yeah, I know I've talked to a number of people out west that are having their 10-year storms. They're having 2 or 3 times a year these days. Yeah. Sounds like that's nationwide.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's shift a little bit. We mentioned the general fund, and we mentioned a enterprise utility fund. I think you'll both probably have kind of things to say on this, but can you guys talk to me about the difference between the two and which one has an advantage and kind of how it has an advantage specifically for stormwater?
Sure. So when we think of the general fund, we typically think of the stormwater being a department within that fund. Same thing like police, fire, parks and recreation. And so oftentimes the stormwater fund is competing with those other resources for tax revenue. And so our preferable method is to see a stormwater utility run through a separate standalone enterprise fund, very similar to a water and sewer utility. You think of it as kind of running a business. And so with a separate standalone enterprise fund, you have a dedicated funding resource, which is typically through user fees. Again, just like kind of a water and sewer, you have users within the services. They essentially provide the revenue for that fund, and then the expenses run through a dedicated fund so that they are not competing with other services within a municipality or a county. So again, the preferable method would be to run it just like a business, and so you run it through a standalone enterprise fund with user fees.
And is that for operational money, like day-to-day stuff, and also capital, or is it just one or the other?
Yeah, so you want your revenues to have an equal amount of expenses. And so that would include your salaries for your employees to manage the utility. That would be your operations. That would be any kind of capital expenses. Your grants would come through that fund as a dedicated revenue source if you receive those. And so you don't want your revenues to be more than your expenses. But in a capital intense environment like a stormwater fund, that's not a difficult challenge to make sure that you have enough expenses that are minimal to the revenue source.
So that seems like there's a challenge there, because if we're, operationally, we can probably take a step back, look at historic costs, look at our labor rates, look at our equipment costs, and kind of get an idea, pretty standard idea of what that operational need is. But from a capital standpoint, everything's dying. So how far ahead do you guys look? How far ahead should we be looking to say, hey, over the next 10 years, I have, let's call it $10 worth of capital expense. Therefore, I need at least $1 a year of capital expense in addition to operational. How big is that window when people are doing these types of plans?
So we like to provide master capital cost planning for a minimum 5. Usually it's a 10-year kind of forward look. And, sometimes those capital expenditures, there's not grant revenue sources for them. And so a utility may have to take on debt. And so those debt payments would be part of that utility fund as well. And it does help spread some of those large capital costs over multiple years, oftentimes outside of that planning period. But we typically like to have at least a 10-year planning period.
10-year planning period, okay.
Yeah. And really, with all that, one item that the stormwater utility helps with is there are requirements for communities now to abide by. There are some programs, mandated programs, that are not funded, like the MS4. So you have to meet all those requirements, and having the money just in the general fund, you will end up trying to just get what you can from the general fund just to meet your requirements that are mandated, and then all your planning and looking ahead and upgrade of your utilities take the backseat until something happens, and then you have to get something from the federal fund and maintain it. Well, if you have your own dedicated source of funding, you can take that proactive approach and plan things, do your master planning assessments and the phases that we talked about early on. And the other item is that you can factor in that, use those funds to really plan on what kind of grants you want to get, what do you want to target, and be able to supplement the funding of the utility to get whether state or federal grants, or maybe even look at low interest rate for certain projects, large capital projects. And that's what Shannon was mentioning just earlier about servicing that you can take on a grant or a loan that has some favorable terms and pay them back with it. So really, these are a couple of the advantages also of having the dedicated funds rather than a fund that you can use it to do absolutely what you have to, and then you're competing with others that will not allow you to to reach the other priorities that you have on the list.
So MS4 is an interesting one because that is one that, it is a nationwide need, nationwide goal, but it does not seem to be a nationwide point of pain or point of interest. I've got some folks I've worked with who, that's the first thing they want to talk about is how do we get compliant? How do we show our documentation? I've got other folks I talk to that, MS what? They're aware of it, but it's just not something they have to deal with. Can we take a second to talk about MS4 and is every community needing to be thinking about MS4? Is there certain qualifications for it? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, there are qualifications for it. So once a community reaches a certain size, and by next year we will have several other communities added in North Carolina, and typically it's like once the population is at 10,000, that's when you become an MS4 community. It can be a little bit less because if you are fringe communities and a certain communities that are around a major area, then you can get also pulled into the program, and the DEQ in here runs the program, and it's a federal program, but in here in the state, it's delegated to the DEQ to run it, and they are going through the process of notifying the new communities next year. I believe that's the schedule now, and we are starting to see plenty more audits, and actually we're helping several communities in compliance with these audits. And some of the requirements of the MS4 is to really inventory your system, and we talked about it in the beginning of having that inventory, knowing where your outfalls are and doing some inspections on the outfalls, as well as inspecting the system. So some of the smaller communities might not need it as much in terms of being an MS4 if they are not there, so they don't have that expense. But even if they don't have it, typically that general fund is lower if you have a smaller community. And with the cost of projects these days, with the construction, it is hard to fund capital projects just from a general fund because it will take a back seat anything that you want to do for planning. And that's what we've seen, where a lot of communities lack that ability to do the planning or to assess what they need in the future. Over the last 2 years, we were lucky there were some available funds to do that planning and grants that we submitted for. But it's not always the case that these funds are available. And having that stormwater utility, even if it looks like a small amount initially, it will help you to plan and target the other grants, and you will have much more ability to receive money once you have a plan in hand, rather than just saying, I don't know what it is, I just have a problem and we need money to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Those guys are the last to get funded typically,
yeah.
If it even comes. Yeah. Well, good. Well, Dory, you talked a little bit about, I've got kind of two phases of this question. I want to talk about kind of the steps to creating that stormwater utility, that enterprise fund, and then kind of shifting over on the finance side, I want to talk about literally how do we look at user rates? How do we look at that cost per? You mentioned that cost for a person. So I know we talked about the assessing, planning, organizing, the construction, but can you give me just a very, very high kind of your version of kind of what does it take to start a enterprise fund for Storm?
Yeah. So with that, I mean, usually you run it in parallel, the two paths between the financing of it and the technical, because you need to know how much you need in order to run your model and see what kind of utility you want and how much fees you need. And at the same time, you want to analyze the area that you have, your geographics, and see how do you want to structure and build your utilities. So all what we talked about before in terms of the technical, it helps support to understand the needs of the community and how would it feed into the financial model. And from there, we'll start to run financial model, and in parallel, we'll run with it the GIS analysis, we call it. It's really a desktop exercise of knowing what is the mix of the community, and we will get into those fees, how they are set, but typically they can be set as flat rate, or it can be based on the use and the land use of the area. And that's where the GIS exercise comes in to identify these parcels, what they are, and what kind of revenue. But in here, I'll stop a little bit on the technical of GIS. I think if we talk about how to set those units and fees with Shannon, and then we can talk about how the GIS is run to support this.
Perfect. Yeah, Shannon, I have to imagine setting the actual rate's got to be very touchy, right? Too low, you don't get anything done. Too high, people are going to revolt. How do you guys kind of walk through that process with setting that rate for an enterprise fund?
So once we have established the technical side in terms of a budget to fund the levels of service that the community needs, we establish a fee for users based on what we call an ERU, which is an equivalent residential unit. And so GIS has some tools that they can utilize to determine the impervious space for residential parcels. And typically we take either, depending on the size of the community, smaller communities, we may look at all of the residential parcels to figure out what that average impervious space is. For larger communities, we may do a 5 or a 10% sampling to get the average residential. And then that average residential is essentially set as the ERU for the community. And as Dory spoke, we can either look at a flat fee per user, or we can look at an ERU equivalency for the multiplier on non-residential parcels. And so typically the most common approach to set a fee is once we determine the revenue needs, we kind of back that calculation into the mix between residential and non-residential parcels in a community. And a common approach is a flat fee per residential. So we'll say $5. For a non-residential, it's based on the ERU. So if you've got 10 ERUs, you've got a really large footprint, then you may be paying $50. And that's typically a monthly fee. And then most communities will apply that either through the tax bill, which ties to the parcel owner, or it can go on the utility bill, which is based on whoever receives the water and sewer utility. So there's really a different approach for every community, and a lot of it depends on a first kind of glance at the GIS data to figure out what's the representation in a community. Is it a lot of really large parcels? Is it a lot of heavy residential? And so there's kind of a different approach based on the community's needs.
Interesting.
Okay. Yep. And then here, Shannon mentioned the impervious area, and really the idea behind the impervious area and why we use it as a measure is that's where you generate most of your runoff. So if we didn't have any of the impervious area, a lot of the rain will infiltrate, will get captured on the spot. We don't have a lot of runoff that is going into the stormwater system that needs management. But once we start to add this, we are adding runoff. And we want some equitable way of that distribution, and that's where the ERU comes in. Because if we have a flat fee of a large commercial area with a parking lot that is equivalent of several houses, maybe a neighborhood almost, it's not fair to have the same homeowner pay that fee as that commercial. So it's really a measure of having an equitable way of distributing the fee based on what you are contributing to the stormwater system. And that's a good gauge to have it to use.
Does anybody meter stormwater? Is that done at any larger industrial types of organizations?
This is almost some type of metering, because to be able to measure it, I mean, you don't want to be able to capture it and meter it by property. So it's a way of metering it is to measure what is your impervious, because we have the science to say this impervious area
you can work backwards,
generate this much.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I guess from a residential standpoint, you know, if I'm paying $5 a month for my size home and I decide I want to add a big patio in the backyard and extend my driveway, does that have a tangible effect, a tangible impact, or is that negligible?
Typically, once we have the ERU, and Shannon mentioned, it depends on the distribution in the community or this. Like if you're talking about a mansion, yes, you will have a tangible impact that is not the same as a typical single family home. And that's why we do an equivalent residential unit where this is the average of the community, and then it becomes a single fee for all the residential units, because there is a good average. Now you have maybe some outliers sometimes that go out there, depending on those community, you might have a tiered approach, but adding a patio onto a home or something typically would not impact that rate, or you will stay within the same as a residential unit.
All right, good. Because I'm in Holly Springs, and we extended our driveway, so I didn't know if I was going to have to pay a few extra bucks each week.
No, you will pay for your mansion the same way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. All right, well, guys, that was awesome. I've probably got 50 more questions I could ask, but I know we've got a time limit here. So let me just open it up to the two of you guys. Any final thoughts or kind of closing remarks before we hand it back over to Tracy to wrap us up?
Nothing from me on the technical. Maybe I'll just wait for the questions this way, just to leave some room to be able to answer for everyone. Shannon, anything on your end?
Yeah, I was just going to add, you know, I come from kind of the finance side, and as Dory mentioned earlier, we definitely want to see equity when we set rates within the community. So that's very important.
Hi there. So that was our interview. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of that. We do have a poll to start our Q&A discussion, hopefully. We know that this is a really meaty, heavy topic. So we want to see how we did in addressing what you guys came here to spend an hour with us to understand. So please let us know. We hope we provided the info you came for. What would you like more information on? What are the pieces of this very meaty topic that we can provide you more details on that would be helpful? General versus enterprise funds, developing a stormwater management program, creating a CIP, setting level of service expectations, establishing user fees, or something else entirely that we may be overlooked that was top of mind. If that's the case, please put that in the Q&A box, and we'd love to continue bringing this type of information to the audience in ways that'll be really helpful to you and your communities. So now we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. So we'll go ahead and answer any questions that you have coming out of that conversation that you want to put in the Q&A box now. And we have Dory and Shannon and Luke here who can answer your questions live. While we're waiting to see what kind of questions come in, Shannon and Dory, the questions that you did get during the conversation, were there any of those that you'd like to expand on a little for the broader audience?
I'll touch quickly on the CCTV question. It can become too costly too quickly to just go ahead and try to do CCTV for everything. So really start with a visual inspection. We can use some pole cameras. It gives you 360 degrees and an assessment of the age of the infrastructure, what we're seeing around the area, what was happening around that time. We will be able to isolate which areas might need CCTV and then proceed that way. You can leave it as a last item and do it on the go and put it in the scheduled inspection. But there's no need to start with the CCTV and expend most of the fund on that level of inspection, while you could use some of it to actually implement some maintenance or some upgrade and capital improvements.
Excellent, thank you. We'll go ahead and take a peek at the results of the poll. General versus enterprise fund, developing the stormwater management program. I was thinking that that would be a really good follow-on to this discussion, is kind of looking at the structure of the program that the utility would support. Service levels, I think that's definitely an area that we want to address in the future, and establishing user fees. Awesome. We'll definitely take that feedback. Thank you all very much, and make sure that we continue to give you helpful information on this topic. I don't see any other questions coming in. I think that Shannon and Dory and Luke just completely covered this topic so well. Shannon, anything else that you wanted to wrap the conversation up before we close the event? We might be having technical difficulties. Shannon, are you maybe in mute? I can't hear you, Shannon, if you're talking. Dory, can you hear her? Is it me, or is her system maybe?
Oh. I'm not sure that she can hear us also.
Well, we will find out Shannon's wonderful closing comments and bring it back to you guys. I'll make sure that you don't miss out on what she was trying to close with, so we can bring that information to you. We will follow up with a couple of different assets and pieces of information immediately after this. You will get a recording of this presentation that you can rewatch or share with your colleagues, and we'll continue to bring this kind of education to you. So hopefully you found this very informative. Thank you so much, Luke, Dory, and Shannon. I think this was a really meaty discussion, and really appreciate your time and attention today. Have a great event, or great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.